Woo!
Yay. Can you hear us? Ben, unmute yourself. Ben might be furiously working on tomorrow's Stratechery update right now. There we go.
No. I there's. I just saw a comic today joking about misplaced meetings and how you can't start. And it was with an engineer. I can't start working on fixing this bug because the meeting is in 40 minutes, and then after that's going to be lunch, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's the same way with writing. There's no starting and stopping. You're either doing it or you're not.
That's great.
Wow. Okay. All right. It's a minute past the hour.
Give it a minute, Sriram. Just give it a minute.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
This should be a fun one. I have many aggregation jokes that I intend to use through this episode. So be prepared, Ben. Hey, Garry. Hey, Steven.
Hey, Ben, Sriram's going to think he's funny. Just kind of roll with it and laugh a lot. It helps him. But he's not funny. And
I know the drill.
These aggregation jokes haven't been funny all day.
Oh, my God.
But just roll with it.
I bring it on myself. I might have referenced it once or twice.
Well, but you missed the last hour of the household where I basically about 5 times said we should strategize about how to do this episode to Aarti. So that was also kind of, I don't know, mildly comedic genius on my part.
Again, not funny. Not even a little. No one here is laughing. You're the only person laughing. Okay, time for the music.
All right. Okay. Anyway, all right. Yeah, I think we 2 minutes past here. We are good to go. Garry, hit the music.
Live from San Francisco and here on Clubhouse, it's The Good Time Show, bringing you today in technology. And now your hosts, Aarti and Sriram.
Woo! Thank you, Garry. Aarti, take it away.
Hey, folks. Welcome. For folks who are joining us for the first time, welcome to Good Time. This is our nightly show that Sriram and I started about a couple of months ago. We have our usual awesome crew of guests. We have Sinofsky and we have Garry tonight. But we also have another special guest. And every night we try and invite somebody new here to talk about, generally about like tech, culture, TV shows, movies, whatever shows up, whatever is like latest, current. We generally try and keep things conversational and casual, and we tend to usually talk about awesome products, just the positive outcomes of tech, that kind of thing. And we've been getting a ton of feedback on Twitter. Keep them coming. I'm Aarti out on Twitter, and Sriram is Sriram K. Yesterday's chat with Brian from Coinbase was great. We just had like a packed room through the whole thing. I'm still wading through my comments on Instagram and Twitter. So that was really, really fun. Thanks so much for all the high quality feedback and just, telling us like what we've done, lots of like notes of appreciation. So really, really appreciate every one of them. Please keep them coming. And for tonight, we have an awesome show ahead of us. And for the introduction of our special guest, here's Sriram.
Awesome. Okay. Before that, I'm going to get to our special guest in just a second. But before that, like Aarti said, we should do the show every single night. And we actually added something today, which has been long asked for, which is we kind of do the show every single night, but we sometimes skip a day. We sometimes change schedules around. We sometimes do it in an East Coast friendly time or Europe friendly time or an India friendly time. So we now have a new phone number, a text number. And you can find the number on my profile. You can find the tweet I just did. The number is 415-322-7800. And just text that number. And we promise you, we won't spam. We won't sell it to some shady characters. We'll just tell you when we have a guest, and we'll tell you when the show is going live. This is something a lot of people have asked for, and we kind of like really thrilled to add it. So 415-322-7800. You can find it on my profile or on my tweet. But no further ado, let me talk about somebody. And this is somebody we wanted on the show for quite a while. Because I would say no other single writer is more widely read in pretty much every, by every tech executive that I know of. Probably no other single writer has influenced more, more founders and more, boardrooms in the tech industry that I know of than the person we have today. So we have the one and only Ben Thompson, and I think a lot of people know him for his writing, but he's actually had a long career, including at Microsoft. Where if I remember, Ben, I think you actually, I think we were all part of Steven Sinofsky's universe at Microsoft. Is that correct?
It is correct. I was actually I was listening to the Steve Ballmer episode the other day, and there were so many Microsoft people on the line, and I
Yeah.
thought I remember that you hear about the PayPal Mafia, and
Yeah.
somehow like Keith Raboy got looped into that, even though he was like super junior at the time compared to like all the executives. And I felt like I needed to now get on Clubhouse, even though I was super junior compared to everyone else on that recording, and I can be part of the Microsoft muddle or whatever we want
Well,
to call
you are
ourselves.
here now, Ben. All five of us here and our speakers have all worked at Microsoft, so you're officially in the club.
That is
right.
true.
That's right.
That is true. We are the Microsoft Mafia right here. Welcome, Garry.
Amazing.
Yeah,
I don't know how I feel about all of this, so just keep going.
Well, you're the only one with a reputation to preserve as far as that
I know,
goes. So
exactly.
I just want to keep going because it is downhill from here. So.
But if you're going to follow the PayPal Mafia, we're all going to move to Miami and then talk about it quite a bit any day.
My family's already there. It's too late.
They're all in bed.
Anyway, okay. So let me get back to my intro. So Ben has had kind of actually a long illustrious career in tech, but I think pretty much what a lot of people here know him for is being the founder and the sole content creator / writer of Stratechery. If you folks haven't heard of it, first I'm shocked. I'm pretty sure if you're listening, you've probably heard of it. But if not, go check it out. Ben, who and I want to talk about, like, lives in pretty much the other side of the world from most people here, but writes something deeply thoughtful every single day about what's happening in the technology industry. And I will, let me assure you, I was pretty much in all the FANG companies, a bunch of other companies in technology. I know that every founder, every CEO, every exec reads Ben's take very, very closely and exactly deeply influence how companies think about things. So, and I'm so excited because we have a lot of things to talk about with Ben. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, I'm happy to be here. I think perhaps you overstate things, but I'll take it. Thank you.
Well, Ben is all powerful. Just not overstate. But okay. So, I know, and I think what we want to get to today is, in some ways, I want to get into the kind of the greatest hits of Stratechery because you have a lot of amazing, frameworks and content I want to get through. But before that, I think your story and how you work is super interesting. And when I've actually asked that, a lot of people want to know that. So let's start with just your story. I kind of hinted at the Microsoft background, but tell us your background and how you got into just, typing out words into a text box every single day.
Well, I actually don't have, you said a long and illustrious career, and that's when I knew you were full of it, because it's not that long, and it definitely was not.
There is no misinformation on this show.
Do
not moderate me.
Oh, this is going to be one of those nights.
No. Well, so I was actually a political. I mean, I remember being first catching sort of the internet. I think I was in junior high school, and I was small town Wisconsin, and like no one around me was remotely interested in tech or any awareness of it, and I found it very interesting, very compelling. I was very interested in sort of how things how things worked. I remember at the time there was I think it was John Stokes used to write at Ars Technica about like processors design and stuff like that. And I would just sort of inhale like all this information about it. And I went to college, but it was weird because my background, I grew up in small town, blue collar, like the idea of like going to work in tech or something like that just never even occurred to me. The idea was that if you were sort of like going to escape that sort of background, is maybe I'd be like a professor or something. That was the only like sort of job that I could even sort of think, imagine. And so I ended up majoring like political science, should I go to law school or something like that, and decided to take a year off. And I ended up going to Taiwan. I was actually working for the Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing in Wisconsin, where you would sort of like type what someone spoke, so someone with a teletype machine could read it, and then you would articulate what they're saying to the other side, and you would have a lot of downtime. And so I would sit there and I would subscribe to the New York Times. I'd bring in the paper into the office every day, and I'd be there reading it, and that was how I passed the time. And there was an article about someone I think it was a bombing in Saudi Arabia. And there they quoted an English teacher who was in Saudi Arabia. And me being a moron, was like, wow, that sounds fun. I think I should go do that. Fortunately, probably for my health, it was probably good. I didn't end up in Saudi Arabia, but I did end up in Taiwan. And I thought I'd just come for a year and then go to graduate school. And it turned out I really loved it. I loved being here. I loved being abroad. I loved working with kids, which is what I was sort of doing at the time. And 1 year turned into 2, turned into 3, sort of turned into 6. And towards the end, I wasn't just teaching. There was a school here that actually had a bunch of branches. I put together a system for them to sync. Like they used to draw these super long boards. I'd put it on a computer and help it sync across everything, like an early version of Dropbox back in the day. But my wife was like, who I'd met in Taiwan. At one point, she was like, all you do when you're not working is read about technology, and you talk about technology all the time, and you think about it all the time. She's like, have you ever considered like working in technology? And at this time, I'm like 26, 27. I'm like, no, I've never actually considered that. That's probably a good idea. And so I ended up applying to business school, even though at the time in technology, the sort of reputation around MBAs was very poor, even more poor than it is now, because this was in the 2000s. Where after the dot-com era, like all these MBAs had flown in and then they all fled. But for me, it was sort of like I had no relevant job experience at all. So it was kind of the shortest, fastest route to sort of legitimacy in the job market. And so I ended up applying to business school. And then I went to Kellogg at Northwestern. And then from there, I was super focused. I got to get a job in tech, And Apple is the one that really sort of gave me the real opportunity for an internship where I worked for Apple University, where I had just gotten off the ground. And it was really cool. I always have appreciate it, where the recruiter said to me, she's like, yeah, you have a really weird resume for someone that's working tech. And she's like, that's why you're going to get the job. And she's like, the way we think about hiring here is if you have we can teach you this, if you have the skills and the understanding, but the sort of the different background, that's where you get sort of like very interesting insights and things along those lines. And went to Apple University, had a great summer. I think I learned a ton really about how Apple thinks about itself, how they operate. Back then, today Apple University is more of kind of an HR program. Back then, it was still very focused on sort of like the very top of the company, and so you got a lot of access and a lot of understanding. And that.
By the way, so Apple University, if I remember, is like the Steve Jobs program to try and kind of pass down the culture of Apple for pretty much like all new. Was it kind of that's kind of my rough understanding of it from that era?
Yeah, and it's like I said, it's kind of shifted over time. But I was there sort of right at the beginning when Joel Podolny was sort of setting it up, and it was funny because they kind of didn't know what they were doing, and so they ended up bringing in like 7 interns, and they had like, and so they're like, oh, but we're not gonna have jobs for interview, by the way. And it's like, well, that kind of stinks, but it actually ended up working out perfectly from my perspective, and because at the time there was this presentation they were putting together, like what makes Apple Apple. And as I understand, this is a presentation that is still sort of widely used sort of within the company. But this was like, there's that famous speech Tim Cook gave on an earnings call, like the Tim Cook doctrine or something along those lines. And that's sort of like the distillation of what makes Apple Apple. But this was sort of like being fleshed out at that time. This was before that earnings call happened. And it was like, how do we think about ourselves? How do we think about product development? How do we think about organizational structure? I've written a few articles about Apple's organizational structure and how it impacts their approach to products and how it both helps and hinders them. And that came directly from sort of the stuff that I was learning that summer. And so it was really, really valuable. But the fact that there was no sort of job at the end actually ended up being perfect, because I kind of got out of that summer as much as I was going to get. But after that, it would have been like going back into the company and sort of like preaching to the choir. Like that's sort of what the job kind of ended up being. And it kind of devolved to being, like I said, more of an HR program over time. And so I feel like I kind of got the perfect gig out of it, where I was able to just go in for 12 weeks and just soak up all this information from like the very heart of Apple about the way they think about things, and then sort of take that, put that in my back pocket, and get other experiences sort of elsewhere.
Okay, so you have a stint at Apple. How did that lead to like what are you doing now?
Well, so the great thing about Apple giving me that chance is now I had a tech company on my resume, and that made it much easier to get jobs. And and I applied to everyone. Like everyone you can think of that was around in 2010, I applied to. And there was some small part of me every time like one of their executives would reach out later after I started Stratechery, and they were like, "Oh, do do consulting or reach out or whatever?" But like, yeah, you could have hired me for like nothing a few years ago, but no one would even read my resume. But Apple being on the resume helped. The other thing that I actually but Microsoft, I got on a team in sort of the Windows. At the time, I think it was under Internet Explorer or OneDrive or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I ended up on the team that basically became the Windows app team, which was the team that was going out to get apps for Windows 8. And this was the summer before I went there was when Steven presented it to Walt Mossberg, I think, at D8, and sort of like the very first version. Mm-hmm. And so I came in sort of right after that, and our team kind of ended up doing that. And it was actually, I got very lucky because everyone on my team was a level 63 or 64, which is sort of Microsoft termies, and I came in as a level 61 as an MBA. But because our team kind of got shifted, I got basically upped into a level 63, 64 job where I had like total responsibility for a few of the categories in the store. I was doing like direct interaction with sort of customers. I was also working with sort of an external third-party shop to like build some of these apps themselves. And so I was like actually doing product management for app development and all this sort of stuff. And I ended up working on like the Kindle app and I think the WordPress app, which were like two of the featured apps sort of right at the beginning. And it was amazing. It was a super fun experience. I would say that it was more fun until Windows 8 launched, and then it probably got a little less fun after that. But
a topic which has been discussed here multiple times. We'll get to.
I'm right here. I'm right here in case anyone forgets. But you keep going.
Let's keep going.
My primary reaction with Steven was I think I was like on my phone like super into a conversation, and I was he drove a little Prius around campus, and I was in his parking spot, and he was like kind of waiting, and then he kind of like honked his horn at me, and I felt very embarrassed because Steve.
I didn't have a spot. You were just in a spot. Not moving.
I was standing in the middle of the parking spot, like on my phone.
That's so typical. That's just what Steven.
Yeah. There is some controversy over the Steven Sinofsky parking incident, which shall not be resolved on this conversation. The famous Steven Sinofsky parking incident.
Yes, this was not the famous one.
Okay. Anyway, all right. So you're at Microsoft, and I think it's kind of fair to say, you're kind of early on in your career. I'm kind of like mid-level Microsoft employee, kind of like I think Arti and I were, right? How did it kind of transition to like writing full time, and also the other side of the world from basically the rest of the tech industry?
Well, so I'd always had the wanting to write about it in mind, and I worked in a student newspaper when I was younger, and I started a bunch of blogs like people do, and never kept them up. And then I was in business school, and part of the tech club, and there's a few other folks, and there's one guy in particular. I think he's on this call. He's still at Microsoft actually, and he was really pushing me that I should restart this sort of writing thing. And part of it was I thought I had something interesting to say. The way I always frame Stratechery is there's lots of people that write about products, and Wall Street writes about the results, but there's a vast sort of expanse in the middle that no one was really talking about, like how things like strategy, things like organizational structure, things like culture and how they impact product decisions and all that sort of stuff. And there's all these things that people would talk about, and complain about on Twitter. I'm like, well, this is actually very easy to understand. Someone just needs to actually write this out and explain it. And so I felt there was definitely an opportunity there. And I sort of looked at, John Gruber during Fireball, and he'd been able to sort of build a career, mostly focused on Apple, writing about this. And I wanted to do that, but it was pretty clear that advertising was not going to be a sort of sustainable way to do that. And so I was definitely thinking about the sort of subscription idea, and it was more a matter of there needed to be sort of the tools to sort of make that happen. And I think that's where, and so I kind of was able to get in towards the end of Microsoft. I'm thinking about, this is what I'd like to do long term. I'd like to go back to Taiwan also, because my wife's from Taiwan. We enjoyed living there. We'd like to go there. And so it'd be kind of cool. I should start a site. I should see how I can build it up, and maybe like 5 years, I could transition into it being my job. And so I started the site while still at Microsoft. And Microsoft is pretty cool about people blogging. It's kind of like just don't be stupid, don't write about your work, et cetera, in a way that you shouldn't. And the reality is the site took off like a rocket. And I think it was, you kind of felt like it was too late. There's lots of sites out there, but the reality is that social media is incredible if you view it as sort of lead generation, it's sort of like marketing. And if you write something compelling, people want to share it, because if it makes them, if they feel it's very smart, they get to share it and feel like, oh, I feel very smart for sharing this, and sort of like, oh, look at this thing I've discovered. And I made a few, I think, good decisions at the beginning. One's interesting is the name. It's still, as Sriram noted, is still pronounced incorrectly. It's Stratechery. But
what? I didn't know. I did not know this. I literally did not know this.
Oh, don't worry. As I've joked on Twitter before, my wife does not know how to pronounce it either. So you're hardly alone. No, it's pronounced all kinds of ways, but it is actually. So I make fun of it all the time. It's always like a joke. I'm terrible at naming things. But the reality is it is memorable in a perhaps a painful way. But it is memorable. I sort of had this, a unique font. I had the orange on the site, and then I had these sort of drawings. And the idea was, if you came to the site and you read an article, they go, oh, that's a good article. But if you came back to the site a second time, you would say, wow, that was a good article. And you're like, wait, I've been here before. And I really wanted to have that sense of like there's a consistency here where it's not just one article that's good. There's multiple articles that are good. And it's something I always say is, if you want to build a site, the most important article you write is the second article someone reads. Because like anyone can write like one really good article. But if they're like, wow, that's good, let's see if there's something else, and they click on another article, and that article is also really good, and then they click on another one, wow, that one's also really good. That just develops you can really build a reputation and sense of consistency, sort of right up front. And then they put you in a bookmark, and then they follow you on Twitter, and then they start looking forward to what there is to come, and like I said, and you'll just share it on social media. And so the site just really sort of took off really quickly. It kind of almost felt untenable at Microsoft very, very quickly, even though I wasn't writing about Microsoft. And so I think I started in March, and I ended up leaving Microsoft in June. And I did get a job at Automattic, which was perfect because they're the blogging company, and like I want to do a blog in my spare time. Like what could be the problem with that? And so Automattic's fully distributed, so that's when I moved to Taiwan. And it actually worked out perfectly because I left on June 30th, and I think it was on July 2nd, Steve Ballmer announced this reorganization of the company that I thought was just ridiculous. And I got a bunch of articles. So I was like, the day I left, suddenly there's a lot to write about Microsoft. And so I wrote like 3 articles about that. And then he bought Nokia, I could write about that. And then he departed the company, I could write about that. And so, and then I could write about the new CEO. And so Microsoft ended up being like perfectly timed to write about Microsoft's sort of a really volatile period there. And so,
by the way, I'm just realizing that there was a missed. I realized there was a missed opportunity. I should have had you on when we had Ballmer the other night, and you could have thanked him for giving you all the content to write about.
I mean, it's funny because I think anyone that has worked at Microsoft, and I loved you guys talking about like those employee meetings and stuff like that. And it's something that's very, Ballmer gets, Steve gets sort of pilloried and mocked because, the developers, you guys talked about that and all that. And I think it's difficult to appreciate, number one, like it's really effective. Like, and I remember even with like the Windows 8 thing, like I worked so hard that year and I was so pumped up for it. And yeah, it didn't work out, but like there was such a sense of camaraderie, and we're gonna like get this out the door. And it's credit to Steve and Steven sort of for making that happen. And that was a great experience, even sort of like in his twilight in some respects. And then you go back to his actual business innovations and the way that Microsoft, really pioneered, the whole, enterprise agreements and the way they changed how companies thought about paying for software in a way that sort of like prepared the ground for all the SaaS companies to follow. Like they owe such a debt to Microsoft and they barely even realize it, and owe a debt to Steve Ballmer. And, I had to criticize them a lot on the way out because there was frankly a lot to criticize. But someone sort of mentioned to me on Twitter when I was, during that Clubhouse, like, yeah, I do have a soft spot for him. Like and I think for good reason.
Okay. So I want to get into, I know we have a bunch of your writing to get into, but like one last question about just the meta of Stratechery, which is, but this, I think I know this is probably the first thing we spoke about when we first had breakfast all those years ago. I think in some ways, the secret behind what you do is your discipline in doing it every single day. And also in some ways, you do it physically removed from the rest of us. It's like a 10+ hour flight to get there. Could you talk to us about your process and kind of the dynamics of not being physically in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I think it's a big advantage, being here in Taiwan. And, one is, not being in the bubble is absolutely a huge thing. And it's interesting because, you're always worried about being in the bubble because you would still be in the bubble online. And, so you think about something like Clubhouse, for example, it's like, obviously everyone in tech's talking about it. Like how can you perceive if it's, if it's elsewhere? But there's still, it's a whole step different being there physically, and where everyone you talk to day in, day out is sort of just in the industry, and being here and being removed from it, I think is a great thing. The time zone is very underrated. Like the fact that I can work during the day, keep normal hours. My kids are could be at school. I'm fortunate enough that the kids can be at school, and can work here, and then I publish it, and it's there when people wake up in the morning. I think is also a big advantage. And I think something about this business, sort of the newsletter business, that's underrated is all your customers will always say, all I care about is quality. If you need to take a day off or take time, that's fine. Just, I'd rather read one good piece than a bunch of, mediocre pieces. And I do think there is a bit of sort of revealed preference where people like getting something on a regular basis and having expectations and building habits around it. And I think that's
you mean like
really,
a late night
powerful.
talk show on Clubhouse with a very funny host?
Half of that. But there's something about like just sort of being there every day. And, people wake up and they tell me that, they read every day on the subway or they read over breakfast and things on those lines. And I think there's something very powerful about that. And you're right, it does feed back, I think, into the writing itself. I mean, I would have horrible writer, I am terrified of ever writing a book. I mean, I think it turns out that blogging for pay is much better paying than writing a book by and large, unless you're Steven doing both. But in part just because there's no deadline. Like people think I'm so productive, and the reality is I just imposed 4 deadlines a week on myself, and that does wonders for your productivity because I don't have a single boss. I have thousands of bosses, and I sort of need to just deliver. And there's some aspect about just doing it. You get into how to do it. I know how to write a daily update. And even when I'm not feeling it, or even when I am feeling it, there's just, you can get it done. And it forces you to think every day. You have to think about what you're writing. You have to do research. You have to read. You have to understand different things. And that just all compounds. And so over time, you've already thought about almost everything. And so it's very easy and quick to sort of put different pieces together. Because you're not starting from scratch.
Okay, so I think this is kind of a great segue into, I want to kind of cover 3 or 4 broad topics I know that you write and think a lot about. And the first one, I think, kind of a great segue from this is you spoke about how you basically have, let's just call it a very large N, thousands of subscribers, who are essentially your bosses every single day. And I think in some ways you were the first of a trend where I think, like, look, Substack has kind of been in the conversation quite a bit for people writing and, either leaving their jobs as, journalists or, building an income when they haven't actually worked as a full-time writer in the past. And in some ways you were, at least the tech industry, one of the first few to epitomize that transition, even though I don't think you use Substack yourself personally. I'm curious, kind of get your thoughts on what this shift means, if anything, for journalism and the media, in the newspaper industry in general. I know this is something you have a lot of thoughts on. Super easy, simple topic.
I mean, I will say, just sort of at the top, people know me as the author of Stratechery, but when I sort of like retire someday and look back at my career, I will certainly be proud of Stratechery, but I'm also equally, if not more, proud of sort of the Stratechery business model. And one, it's sort of gratifying that I sit around and tell everybody else what to do. And the fact that I've actually done something myself and sort of created something on my own, I think is just sort of meaningful to me personally. But also I do think that it's really cool to see people building, new careers doing this sort of thing. And the reality is someone would have figured this out. So I hesitate to give myself too much credit. And the real credit goes to platforms like Stripe, goes to things like WordPress, open source project, and things on those lines that provide the tools and the infrastructure so that anyone can do this. And this is, and these are the kind of companies I love. like whether it be like a Shopify or something, like the companies that provide the infrastructure and tools and platform for people to sort of like build their own businesses and serve these niches. Like the internet is so broad. And it's funny, you hear people talk like there's going to be subscription fatigue and all these sorts of things. And I think there's a sense that everyone, like there's this pool of subscribers that all look like me, and how are we going to pay for everyone? And the reality is that there's the internet is so vast. I mean, this is something that everyone in this room understands because we all work in the internet. But I remember the first day I was at Microsoft, and I went into a Hotmail monthly like update meeting or something, or a monthly review or something. And Hotmail, like who uses Hotmail? And it was mind blowing. Like just the sheer numbers you're talking about. But then number two, the matter of fact way that people were just going through it. Okay, Brazil this quarter, blah, 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 Argentina. And these crazy numbers are going by, and it barely just caused a ripple. And it's like, it's so, you all talk about, oh, it's hard to understand the scale of this stuff. It's really hard to understand the scale of this stuff. I remember being at Automattic, same thing. And it would blow your mind how many people start blogs every day. Like blogs are dead. Dude, it's crazy. Like and you think about that, and now you apply that to something like Facebook or Twitter, and it's hard to imagine. And the crazy thing is, what I found with Stratechery is when I started, I sort of went independent. And, believe me, lots of people told me it wasn't going to work. And what I realized was, even people in tech that know this in their day job, how big the internet is, still have a hard time really understanding the implications of that. And the reality is, I only needed 1,000 people, like to make $100,000 a year. Like that's, and the scale of the internet, that's really not that many. And so I thought I'd do that. I thought it'd take like 5 years. It ended up taking 6 months. And from there, honestly, it's blown my mind. Like I never do this. I just wanted to make like the same money I made at Microsoft. That was my goal. And I've been able to do better than that for myself. And it's still kind of it still kind of blows my own mind. And it makes me so enthusiastic about this space, because all those niches can be filled by individuals or small companies that would never work in the real world, but are uniquely enabled by the internet because the whole world's their addressable market. And I'm sorry, I don't know if I answered your question, but it's just something that I'm it drives a lot of what I get very excited about.
Okay, I actually have one tiny story here and a follow-up. So, I mean, for both Arti and me, we've spent a large part of our careers in these kind of large-scale internet companies, and where you often deal with the numbers you talk about, like tens of millions, hundreds of millions. But I will say the last few weeks of doing this Clubhouse show, where we are directly interfacing with people, and every night when you finish a show, we get like dozens, if not hundreds of DMs. It gives you a sense of scale, which is kind of weird because I know the numbers. I always knew the numbers intellectually, but having people reach out to you directly gives you like a very different emotional feeling, which I think, okay, I want to ask you something else. And this is something which, I think there's been a lot of discussion on Twitter and other places about it, which is the idea of you as a writer and having customers and how that shapes your incentives. I remember, having conversation with Casey Newton, I think on Twitter a long time ago, where he said when he moved to doing his newsletter, all of a sudden he's kind of, there's an audience and a customer base who have feedback and input, and how that shapes his thinking. How do you think that's kind of shaped your output? And because I think it's kind of like a hot topic when it comes to journalism right now.
Yeah, and I think a lot of my sense, okay, let me be super clear. I haven't worked in traditional journalism, and I don't consider myself a journalist. I'm not. I think about journalists as sort of like they're reporting stuff that happens in the world. I'm providing analysis, and I depend on and appreciate deeply sort of journalism. Like without journalists, I could not do my job. And so I think it's important to sort of have that clarification there. And I think that gets to, is what I do the answer to journalism? No, I don't think so. I think it's an addition, but you need both. So that's point number one. I think number two, my sense is a lot of tech people I think are a little off base when they point to journalism suddenly was motivated by clicks, and that is why journalism has gone wrong or some of those lines. And I'm not sure that that's the case. I think my sense is, and one of the things I really appreciate about this model, and when I started writing Stratechery, is when you first start writing publicly, you get sort of feedback on Twitter, like Twitter is very good at providing feedback. And I was very
What? No one tells you anything bad on Twitter. Everyone loves everything. Everyone does.
Exactly. I was very fortunate enough to notice pretty quickly that it was kind of the same people tweeting me all the time, and when you combine this with the fact that, okay, there's some number of people that are tweeting me all the time, but I look at my subscriber numbers, and my subscriber numbers are much higher than the number of people tweeting me all the time. And it was sort of a reminder, I need to not over-index on Twitter, because there's a certain kind of person with a certain kind of view that is going to come at you on Twitter. And it's very easy, I think, to get anchored in that and to lose sight that you have a broader base. And this is what I think is so valuable about the subscription model is, on one hand, because it's cheap, I don't really care if people get mad and leave, right? It's a tremendous luxury. On the other hand, it's something that anchors me in do what I'm doing. Don't get distracted by what people are saying on Twitter, because the reality is they're by definition a small part of your base. And so what I'm curious about from the journalist perspective is they all come back to this comment, oh, you do it for clicks. Oh, we don't even know what our clicks are. It's all hidden from us. And to me, well, then what are you left with? You need
do you believe that?
To measure yourself.
Do you believe that?
I don't know, but I think but what I wonder about that is everyone wants feedback. So if you don't have clicks or you don't have money, then you're going to end up, Twitter's your feedback mechanism. And you end up with Twitter where you have all these journalists who are on Twitter all the time giving each other feedback. And you end up in this sort of mechanism where everyone sort of converges on a similar point of view on a particular topic, because there is actually insufficient feedback. I don't know. This is a theory.
I think
just because I feel that Twitter pull so strongly, and I so appreciate the fact that I have a different feedback mechanism that is based on dollars and cents, and that sort of keeps me rooted.
By the way, I think one, by the way, when I was at Twitter, I think one of the challenges that you often saw was it can be, because I think this is broader. I know we're talking about journalism, but I think it's kind of like a broad phenomenon on Twitter, which is it can be very easy to get into this very narrow feedback loop where you'll start listening to like a few people over and over again. I remember, in one of my previous jobs, I had a rule where I said, like, if this person is giving us this product feedback, we can't listen to it because that's the only person we always listen to, and they're always tweeting at us. And you kind of get this very narrow feedback loop, and you're not looking at, for every person who's tweeting at you, there's probably 100 people who either love you or they hate you, and you're not hearing from them. By the way, Ben, I do think like a lot of other publications have had like dashboards, and there's always been these companies like I'm blank on them, but they didn't give you metrics. But I think your point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not, like I said, I haven't worked in a newsroom, so I'm not going to speculate on that. My whole point though is I actually think feedback mechanisms are really useful, and it actually worries me if someone argues they have no feedback mechanisms, because that's a lie. Everyone needs a feedback. Everyone finds a feedback mechanism, whether they know it or not. And I just feeling that sort of Twitter pull, I do worry about Twitter producing exactly what you said, that sort of echo chamber, and that's actually maybe more of the issue.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We are at a little past the halfway point. So I wanted to just reset the room for folks who are joining in later. This is a nightly show called Good Time. Tonight we have Ben Thompson of Stratechery. Man, I'll never ever get used to it. I just thought it rhymed with Stratechery.
Don't worry, that's like 45% of people. So you're in very good company.
I know, I've been reading it for years now, and I just didn't know. It's so crazy. And so, yeah, so Stephen, sorry, I had this question I was just chatting with Stephen about on, Ben, you talk a lot about aggregation theory, and, there's just a lot of content that you write about here. And, I think one of the things for folks here who are just like listening to you, explain to us what it is. You write about it in the context of how in the internet age, this is a new framework. This is the way startups, companies should think about businesses, should think about how things scale. Explain to us what aggregation theory is all about.
Well, it's one of those things where I think I first coined the term, I think 6 years ago now, and was sort of writing around the edges of it probably 7 or 8 years ago. So it sounds, I think it sounds super obvious now, but it was I think back then there was still the sort of sense and idea that the internet is going to lead to these sort of far-flung, disparate dispersal of information. You can go to lots of different places, et cetera, et cetera. And sort of the core idea of aggregation theory is actually the internet drives towards centralization. That's like the natural state of affairs, because there's companies that can set off these virtuous cycles where they deliver something superior, they get a sizable user base that brings on sort of like the suppliers for their platform on, and which makes it more attractive to users. You get this virtuous cycle on, and because of zero marginal cost on the internet and the free distribution, it can scale infinitely. Like in the real world, of course, there's economies of scale, but there's like a cap on just how big a company can get, because you can only serve so many customers. You can only make so many widgets. Well, on the internet, there is no cap. You can serve the entire world, and you can create infinite numbers of bits. And so the implication then is, actually, no, there's not going to be a disruptor to Google. No, there's not going to be a disruptor to Facebook or Apple or these other companies. They're going to become actually way more powerful and way bigger than you think. And when I was writing this, Apple is at a few $100 million or a few $100 billion company. Now they're and so back then it wasn't at all clear that this is actually the way it was. I think it was a little counterintuitive. Whereas I think now it's like, well, actually that's quite obviously the case, and who could have ever thought otherwise?
By the way, I think you actually touched on something which I really appreciate, which is that that aggregation theory, it talks about something being different for the internet era, as opposed to just being compounding feedback loops / economies of scale that we've always historically seen. And the key to this being, it doesn't cost Google anything really extra to do an additional search result, for example, right? And one of the things I appreciated is you kind of have I think there's a Wikipedia page about Ben Thompson, just like Clayton Christensen has a theory everybody knows him for. I think aggregation theory, Ben, is probably going to be the thing that you're going to be known for at least the last 10 years of your work. What are some of the downstream implications of aggregation theory?
Well, I think we're seeing it play out now. I mean, I wrote a piece, I think a couple of weeks after I wrote aggregation theory, that was called Antitrust and Aggregation or something along those lines. That was basically saying it's inevitable that we're going to get these cases, number one. But then number two, these cases are going to be very problematic from a sort of legal perspective, because there's no, traditional antitrust is they're controlling supply, right? They're controlling, the way things, or distribution. In this case, it drives people up the absolute wall that Larry Page, has famously said, another search engine is just a click away, or another site is just a click away. And the reason I think it makes people so angry is because it's true. You really can just go to another site, or you really could just type in a URL directly. And the fact that Google is so good at what they do that it's just easier to start there, and everyone just does that endlessly, and thus Google has tremendous power, is it's very challenging. It's challenging because on one hand, it's well, how can you begrudge them making things so easy for customers that customers keep choosing to use Google? On the other hand, it's well, at what point do we worry about the sort of the broader implications of companies like this having so much power? And it's very challenging. I think one of the mistakes that I think the real unease people have with these companies is really less about consumer welfare, because there's obviously so much consumer welfare that comes from these services, and just more an unease about power. It's people are nervous about how big these companies are and how powerful they seem to be. And I think the mistake people make is, because it's big, they immediately reach for antitrust as the solution, when the reality is the solution is Congress. It's passing laws that are actually intended for this new unique situation, and be oh, you can never pass laws in Congress. It's well, we passed the antitrust laws at some point. So that, just because it's hard doesn't mean that's not the right way to do it. And I think in the long run, when and if there are ways to effectively deal with tech, if that does need to happen, it should happen and will happen legislatively, as opposed to through the courts.
I love what you said about that there should be laws passed, but there is that reaction, oh, tech is different, that that generates that, like, oh, well, because it's tech, we need all different laws, that a lot of people in antitrust don't think that that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, they are, and they don't like me very much. And it's one of those, it's very risky to go out and say this time is different, except for like the one time where it is different. And I think this is certainly a broader theme that I do write about is I put the internet, I used to say the internet was like the Industrial Revolution. I think that was a mistake. The internet's like the printing press. And it's a completely new way to distribute information, to generate information, to it doesn't just make it trivial to have output at scale, but also input at scale, which is completely new. And you look back and the printing press changed the world, like at a very fundamental way. And if you think of the internet, and I think you should, then it seems like to say that antitrust doesn't quite apply is like the most obvious of outcomes. That's one of a million things that are going to be different in my estimation.
One thing, by the way, so Ben, I want to kind of get through, in some ways, like kind of the greatest hits of, like, I think from the last year or two of your writing. And by the way, for folks who, first of all, let me put a plug out there for Ben. If you haven't followed his work, go out there. I highly encourage subscribing to Stratechery. I think it's definitely worth an investment, especially if you're in the tech industry or aspiration to be in the tech industry. It is, at least, you'll definitely learn from it. It'll also give you a sense of what everyone's talking about. And I highly suggest like reading Ben's, actually Ben has a section on his site called Aggregation Theory, and he's written a lot about antitrust and kind of the history of it. I highly recommend reading that. Okay, I want to move on to another topic. And by the way, Ben, I like that, we went from like fun life stories to all the spicy stuff now. So I think the other topic, which I think it just which is connected to the theme of companies becoming powerful, is the topic of moderation. And I would say this is a topic which I've tried to avoid on Twitter, just because I think just like talking about it, like it's just really hard to discuss this with any sort of nuance, especially in like short character bursts. One of the things I've liked about your approach to this is you actually try to outline a principle framework, and you try to kind of like fit in various incidents, be it the former U.S. president, or be it the the Parler deplatforming, or CloudFront taking down is it Daily Storm? I forget the name. And you try to kind of put things in a framework. So could you talk to us about your moderation framework when it comes to content on the internet?
HN, CloudFront, yeah.
Yeah, no, they all run together, sadly enough.
Yeah.
I do think it's important when it comes to, you have to start with principles, and those are the things that will carry through across things like printing presses or internet, like getting to the sort of the very core. And I think when I think about you think big picture about how tech should think about interfering with politics, for example. Excuse me. I sort of put like number one, like liberal principles sort of have to be number one, like small L liberal, like whether it be free expression or free association or whatever it might be. And again, I'm not coming out as saying I'm a free speech absolutist. There's multiple dimensions to what liberalism means. Number two, there's sort of like democracy, that matters. Number three is sort of like what you actually believe. And this sort of came up, I think, when Trump was first elected, and he had that meeting of executives, and there was a lot of calls in the tech industry that saying that tech executives should not go because, like, for example, his stance on immigration. And it's like, okay, tech broadly, of course, is extremely in favor of immigration. It's been a huge boon to the industry, and it's a huge boon to the country. There's a single sort of non-controversial view in tech that is probably it. But
by the way, there are multiple immigrants. I mean, Arti and I are obviously immigrants ourselves, and we are like highly benefited from the U.S. immigration process.
No, I'm second immigration. I'm second generation too. So that's obviously very important. But then number two, but that's number three. Like what you believe about a particular policy. And at the end of the day, he was elected president, and you don't get to sit there and say I'm not going to meet with the president because I disagree with the sort of policy. That's sort of like that has your priorities sort of out of order. And and these priorities I thought were very useful when it came to, for example, what happened on January 6th, where, okay, obviously we all disagree. Number two, we're in a situation where democracy is actually being challenged, like the outcome of election. And then number one, liberalism means these companies this is unique, I think, to the West and particularly unique to America, which is the very sense of individualism. These companies have rights too. They can decide what to do. And if they believe that 2 and 3 are in order, then, well, they have the freedom to act, and they did. And I respect people who come down the other side. So this is the Democratic elected president. Taking him off Twitter is a horrible abuse of power. And I certainly can make that argument. When I wrote that they should take him down, I actually wrote two. I wrote the one where they should and the one where they shouldn't. And I went and sort of sat on it. And I'm like, which one do I think is the right one? And I went back to that framework that I'd written down, 4 years previously. I'm like, well, I put liberalism first. And so that was sort of my thinking there. And so that's sort of number one, is having principles. Number two is like, how do you actually moderate? Because when there's bad stuff on the internet, who's responsible? Because if everyone's responsible, then you end up with ISP level takedowns, and you're basically, this is sort of like and that's not Chinese level, but you're approaching that, where you go to an ISP, you're like, oh, there's something way up the stack that is bad, take it down. And to me, that's very bad. It's very problematic. It's infringing on fundamental liberal values. And the way that moderation should work is it should happen at the place on the stack where the harm is happening. So Twitter, if they want to take down a tweet, go ahead. If Twitter wants to take down a New York Post article, I think that's bad, because the New York Post is responsible for what they write, and Twitter's not the right level of the stack. And you can go down, but underneath, Facebook or Twitter, there's something like AWS, and under AWS, there's something like Cloudflare or DNS providers or whatever it might be. You kind of go down the stack as to where the lower you go, the less you should interfere, and the only thing you should act on is like a legal requirement. And the higher you go, the more freedom you should have to act. So that's sort of like the framework that I try to apply. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, and I think what is so challenging about the internet is, it turns out that there's a lot of stuff that we thought were sort of values that were more, we didn't have the capability. And what is challenging is the fact that because we can moderate, because we can take stuff down, the calls to take down everything I disagree with are so easy to sort of act on. And I think figuring out a way to navigate that going forward is going to be, exceptionally challenging.
So let me ask something. First of all, I'm listening to all this with kind of like a lot of emotions, because as people can imagine from my past, kind of like a couple of jobs, this has kind of been like a large part of my life, and I have a lot of opinions on this. But I'll kind of keep my opinions to the side. And I think one of the arguments that you're going to hear for the viewpoint that you just stated, Ben, is when some content is harmful, that it is actually worth these tech companies breaking these principles and making an exception just because of the harm this could create. And I think that's kind of the argument you saw.
I don't think it's. Let me jump in. I don't think it's breaking principles. I think there's a difference between principles and rules, and you have to start with principles, because principles tell you when you should break your rules. And to me, this is a big mistake Twitter made with Trump in particular. I think that Twitter kept trying to restate their rules such that it would give them a reason not to take Trump down. And the reality is, we've argued about this. This. And I think Twitter would have been better off from the beginning saying, look, he's the president, his account's not coming down. And I think that would have clarified everything. Instead of saying, oh, because he violated this rule, blah, blah, blah. And then January 6th, I actually thought Zuckerberg's statement on this was perfect. He's like, yeah, we didn't take him down last summer because he was the president. Now we're in a different period, and that was totally across the line, so he's coming down. It's like, was that totally ad hoc and sort of like, contextual? It was, but that's because all these decisions are ad hoc and contextual. So let's be honest about it.
Okay, so what about using the same framework, in different lens, out of just like the president's actions, the former president's actions? I think there's kind of been a lot of chatter about what happened with Parler, what happened to them and AWS and the Google, the app stores, and then I think the push towards more decentralization. And I think I'm kind of to get your take on the former, because I think it kind of touches on the moderation topic that we talked about, and maybe to some extent the previous topic about like companies and the power they have, but also about the future of the internet and what could an internet 3.0 look like. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, this actually goes back to aggregation theory. I mean, I think the economic the economic sort of incentives for centralization are so strong, because I mean, building like cloud infrastructure is so expensive, and once that, it just makes so much more sense for everyone. Basically, all of Silicon Valley has basically all handed off sort of cloud, their server infrastructure at Amazon, and it just makes it's great because you can have way more companies. It used to be your Series A was just to get money to buy Sun servers, right? And now, by the time you get to Series A, you might have 1 million customers, because it's so much easier to get off the ground and sort of get started. And it's such a change in the way it's been transformational. You see the same thing in the chip industry. All the chip companies used to make fab their own chips, and basically everyone's handed it off to TSMC. And now you're seeing an explosion in sort of chips out there, because one company will make the billions of dollars of investment necessary to sort of make it happen. And the internet, TSMC, that's a physical product, but the internet is the same thing, but to an even greater extent, because you're dealing with these zero marginal cost goods. And so the incentives to have just AWS and Azure and GCP, for example, are super overwhelming. What I think was so interesting about the Parler thing in particular is, I think it was a real sort of like shock in many respects to lots of other countries around the world that, okay, there's actually a tremendous amount that we're giving away, power we're giving away to these tech companies, and they're going to be consumed with American politics first and foremost. Like they will throw away their sort of reputation as a cloud provider because of American politics. And again, that's separate of whether it's the right or wrong thing to do. That's a valid thing for India to think, for Germany to think, whatever it might be. And you see the same thing with TSMC from an American perspective. It's like, is it actually a good thing that the most advanced chip production in the world is 100 miles from China? Like, given the fact that if there's ever a war, it's probably going to be with China. Like, that's not a great thing to do. And I think it's been sort of a wake up call. And what's so interesting about this is the solution to this is decentralization. And that could be via open source, where it's decentralized work and you can sort of fork it and take what you need. It could be crypto, and sort of that is inherently decentralized. And it's funny, that piece, people like complain when I share about crypto, and it's like, well, that Internet 3.0 piece is basically a PN to crypto, and why it's so compelling, and why it is the antidote to aggregation theory. That's what crypto is, by being fundamentally decentralized.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I'm unsure about, and I put that out there as I think this is the way things are going to go. I don't know what the timeline is, and I don't know. It's because the economic incentives, again, for centralization are so strong. And how much of a balance, how much of political will is there going to be to build something that's less efficient, that's more expensive, that works worse, but it gives you freedom and it gives you independence? And
Right.
I think that's, and I don't know the answer to that, particularly from a corporate and government perspective. Obviously, from an individual perspective, we're seeing in crypto that's a massively alluring, and I think
Yeah.
it's going to carry that forward. And so, to me, that's by far the most interesting thing over the next decade.
Yeah, I think that brings me to this one question on, you've talked a lot about, aggregation theory, you've talked about moderation framework, and you have, really great ways to, have this sort of a meta framework for just tech overall. But one question I guess I wanted to ask, and maybe this might be our last question for the night, because we're like pretty close to 11 p.m. here, is what's the area in tech, in your framework, this overall framework for tech that you have, that you're like not that confident, or I guess it's work in progress, or it's still unresolved? What's the one where you feel like you just you're like least confident about?
Oh, it's what I just said. It's like, what is going to be the balance between centralization, the
And
economic
decentralized,
imperative for
right?
centralization, and decentralization sort of going forward? And I think when it comes to crypto and stuff, I think like open source is probably a useful analogy, where back in the 90s, it was for a lot of people it was weird. For a lot of people, like, it's never going to work, and and we were still waiting for Linux on the desktop. But it turned out that there were completely new use cases, the cloud in particular, where it was such an obviously better solution that if you actually looked at it, Linux has won, right? And even though it never took over the desktop, and I think for crypto, I think for any sort of new technology, they rarely take over what already exists. Like that, like, we talk about Clubhouse. Like, is Clubhouse going to take over a podcast? Well, no. Is it going to, Microsoft didn't, like, they're still or whatever IBM sells, mainframes, right? Windows is still out there. But there's an eclipse that happens where something does new things that were not possible before. And those new things are so powerful and so accessible that they become even greater than what came before. Even though what came before it continues to exist and continues to be useful. I think this is a great thing about tech. Tech tends to be very additive. Like, stuff that's there is still there. There's just new stuff on top of it. And so to me, I think that's going to be the case generally. What I'm not sure about is what the balance is. Again, particularly when it comes to the sort of businesses that would go to AWS or would go to GCP or that would be on Facebook or whatever it might be. Like, how is the usability going to get to a level to overcome all the other obstacles? I mean, you talk about Clubhouse, like, everyone's like, oh, Clubhouse, ingests all your contacts. Like, well, guess what? Everyone's awfully happy to do so just because they want access to it. People's revealed
they want a good time.
Yeah, people's revealed preference. That was a good one. Congratulations.
Thank you. I tried.
People's revealed preference is often very different than their stated preference, and you see that again and again.
Okay, Ben, I know we're out of time. One last question. By the way, Ben is awesome on Twitter, but better than Ben is his alt account, No Tech Ben. So Ben, let us say tomorrow you take over ownership of the Milwaukee Bucks. What do you do?
Well, I built a time machine to go back and undo some terrible decisions that were made previously. I would change the coach. I think we'd run our course as far as that goes. No, I would back up. I think that a problem that franchises make again and again is where owners like me, who actually don't know anything about basketball, think they do, and they get too involved in sort of what goes on. So I would go to go to Daryl Morey, and I would say, I don't care how much Philadelphia paid you, I'm going to pay you. Or Masai Ujiri from Toronto works too. His contract's actually up. I would say, look, I just spent hundreds of billions of dollars on this team, and here, have X percent of it. Masai, come be my GM, and you fix the problem. That's the correct answer. But yeah, the Bucks are frustrating. They are, Giannis resigned, so obviously that's a great thing. But I would say it's funny because I can't, I'm not good at telling players, I'm just a fan. Like, people are like, oh, why don't you write about basketball? I'm like, because I succeed by writing about things that I know about and ignoring things that I don't. And so me writing about basketball would be a bad idea. But I do sort of, intuitively get sort of asset management and, the way the NBA works from that perspective. And it's frustrating because right now you're seeing the outcome of decisions that were made years ago. And yeah, I definitely criticized on Twitter years ago that are sort of playing out in real time. And so it's almost kind of like, well, I'm not going to be too worried about it because I knew this is going to happen. So the Bucks are still in
but
it.
Plus, besides, look, it's
win,
more championships for LeBron, so I'm not complaining.
Yeah, congratulations to him. Still not as good as
wow.
Okay, so on that note about LeBron winning championships, I think, okay, we're out of time. I need to wrap this. Okay, first of all, many thanks to many people here. I want to thank the audience. It's been amazing. We had like over 4,500 people, almost 5,000 people throughout. Turns out Ben's a really popular guy, and so thank you so much. And also thank you for all the tweets and all the DMs, especially from all of you kind of learned to pronounce Ben's company for the first time today. So there's been a lot of that. Ben, you have quite the treat waiting for you when you open up Twitter right after this. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Love all the thoughts as always. Want to thank our usual motley crew, obviously Arti. Want to thank Steven for everything he does, and also for putting up with Ben in the parking lot all those years ago.
I'm sorry, Steven. I apologize.
I got nothing to say on that.
Yeah. I mean, like, we all know that Prius drivers are known for being dangerous and reckless. So, one small mistake from Steven, and we would not have Ben today. So thank you, Steven.
Also, that was like a vintage Prius, like way back.
It was like the first one or first or second one. Yeah. It was not new.
Yeah, Stephen living up to the image of tech bros with a vintage Prius there, and of course Garry also part of the Microsoft mafia. But most of all, Ben, thank you so much for doing the show. I know Ben has all his own content going on, so it's kind of like a huge delight to have him on the show. And if you folks are not reading already, if you're interested in tech, highly suggest you go on to stratechery.com and go subscribe. He's awesome. So Ben, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. And sorry again, Stephen. I didn't mean it.
I'm good. We're all good. We're all
right,
friends
so
here on Good Time.
One last thing. So Ben, I know you listen to the show, and I think we always try and pick a song which matches the guest or the content of the show. And since we've been talking all about aggregation theory, I thought of things getting aggregated and coming together to form something bigger than some of the parts. So Garry, can you play us out to the title song from Pacific Rim? I love this for you, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Sriram.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. By the way, I should say we're going to have a show. We're going to take a break tomorrow. We're going to be back on Thursday on a slightly different one-off time. We'll announce that. Again, I want to plug the number. We are 415-322-7800. It's on my profile. It's on my tweet. Text us, and you'll keep updated on all the show timings. We take a break tomorrow. Have a good night. We'll see you on Thursday. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.